About this time last year, I received a notice that my estimated property taxes were going to be raised quite a bit. Like many others do, we pay one bill with the mortgage and taxes all included every month. And as that notice came, I had 1 month to prepare for my new payment schedule, which would increase my typical bill by over 45%. I'm not exaggerating. That meant that for the next 6 months, I had to pay ahead the majority of what was predicted to be my tax bill for the whole year. Fortunately, by July, most of the pain was over. And yet, given the total estimate, my monthly payment would not return to what it had been for so many years. Instead, after the summer, my monthly payment would continue at over 20% of what it used to be. Now, 20% is better than 45%, but it's still a decent amount to pay when nothing else in life has fundamentally changed for us. Another thing that is fortunate is that I know I'm definitely not alone in this. Isn't there some modern proverb that says some things are permanently embedded in this life? None of us like to have our taxes go up, and we can do very little about it in the larger picture. But when finances are harder and harder to keep and prices continue to rise, it is natural to start thinking more about money and financial security. It's also normal to start wondering about how life might be different if our bank accounts were bigger than they were. With a little bit more, or maybe a lot more, life would be better, right? If we have more put aside for a rainy day, then let the rain come, right? I even found a verse that seems to support this idea that more is better. Feasts are made for laughter, and wine makes life merry, but money is the answer for everything. Trust me, it is not what it sounds like, but we'll deal with that verse on some other occasion. For now, we come back to a study that we set aside as we enter the holiday season. It's been 3 months since we looked at the book of Ecclesiastes, and yet the topic of finances, wealth, and riches is one that shows up with greater focus near the middle of the book. And before we get there, let me offer a quick review of what we've uncovered so far in our examinations of Ecclesiastes. The writer refers to himself as the teacher or the preacher, Kohelet. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile. These verses are his initial observation. Let me go back one. About life. Things don't seem to work out the way we would expect that they should. And then later in the opening chapter, he describes the quest that he has undertaken and recorded for us in the Old Testament based on this opening observation. So he says, I, the teacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to seek and to explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. As a teacher looks at life, he has set out to investigate what lasting value may be found in our days here on earth, life under the sun. And as we've come to see, the style of writing is repetitive, like a spiral. The teacher moves from subject to subject and often doubles back on himself, picking up earlier themes. This fits the excruciating nature of his experience as he seeks to put the pieces of his world together, a world that is disintegrated in his hands. The journey into and through despair is anything but linear, and as is typical in such experiences, moments of great insight are often followed by lapses back into old struggles, so that the journey is more of a spiral than a straight line. And as we read through that spiral over the past year or so, at least last fall, this is his challenge to us. The teacher invites us to engage with him in his journey and struggle to pursue clarity in life. As he makes his observations of this world, he wonders how it is that so many parts of our experience are what they are instead of what they should be. And when we left off in October, I highlighted what has become obvious to us as we move from one chapter to the next. The teacher does not offer grand solutions to the problems of the earth. Ecclesiastes instead is primarily a collection of life observations and life experiences, more like a personal journal. It is an earthy and realistic record of the human journey. And so the author expresses his own frustration concerning how things work or don't work in the world. And yet, in taking on his quest, the invitation for us is to get dirty in the mud with him and just let that yuck kind of wash over you for a while. Now, since we've already dealt with a few repeating concepts, many of us are starting to feel that. And as we read one chapter after another, we have come to appreciate what the teacher has said. There is nothing new under the sun. So we see it. Life appears to go in cycles. Things don't work as we expect. The bad win, the good lose, and what we work so hard to obtain seems to just vanish. We get it. But there is some good that comes out of all of this if we take advantage of what God has written for us. As I've said a few times already, that gnawing sense of where will this lead? Or what's coming next? What's the value in it? Is something that people that we know and love live with all the time. The people that we care about who yet don't know Christ. That sense of futility is captured so well in Ecclesiastes, and yet in many cases it is the whole experience of most people in the world. So our study of this book allows us to gain some empathy and appreciation for those outside the faith who cannot see beyond the visible creation. Life under the sun is all they understand. They don't have or have not seen the end of the Bible. So they don't embrace the divine revelation of God that offers us a larger, more comprehensive picture of our time down here and where it ends up. But those who belong to Christ do. We have been given an eternal insight that goes beyond what is experienced on earth. As a result, we know that the yucky repeating cycles of loss and gain, along with the moments of joy spread out in a lifetime of difficulty, will end. Now, if you recall, there are a couple of major themes that tie the book together, and both of them also intersect the issue of finances and wealth. The theme that we see most often is the one that we've been talking about so far and found in the introduction: futility, absolute futility. Everything is futile. The Hebrew word is hevel, and it shows up almost 40 times. It's translated differently because it can have a range of similar meanings: empty talk, like a breath, worthless idols. While most familiar translation for us of the word hevel might be vanity, it is not the most helpful word for us. What that means now and what that meant hundreds of years ago is not the same. Now, today, vanity is still empty and without value in its absolute sense. However, more often when we think about that term, vanity has to do with arrogance and self-sufficiency. That is not how the author uses this word in Ecclesiastes. It's not also about without any meaning, which the NIV uses, and I love the NIV, by the way. They say everything is meaningless. The Christian Service Bible says everything is futile. The King James says vanity. You see, this is about the fact that what we observe in life so many times does not fit together neatly, and even when it does, it doesn't last very long. The term communicates that the inconsistencies that we see and experience on a core level cannot be grasped. They are an enigma, at least to us, not to God. And so we feel that sense of futility or vapor. To understand the use of this word even better, we need to look at the other theme that repeats consistently throughout the book. The meaning of hevel is clearly demonstrated in the remainder of the opening passage. So right after futility, absolute futility, everything is absolutely futile, what does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? The gain or profit has to do with long-term benefits. It's a word that's used in the commercial sector, having to do with dividends or profits after all the expenses have been paid. So what advantage is there? What benefit is there? What's left over after all of our efforts? Is what we spend our time on and labor investing in really worth it in the end? The question is rhetorical because the anticipated answer every time the author raises this question is no, nothing. But once again, for those of us who know Christ, this result is not surprising. The Lord promised that once sin entered the creation, we would work really hard against the obstacles of this earth, thorns and sweat, and produce very little for it. Following this introduction, the teacher has taken us to observe life as it is, in various spheres of life, in the open creation, in the courtroom, in the marketplace, the highway, and the palace grounds. For us, that would be our individual homes. And in every one of those locations, he found many things lacking and futile. Yet he also found things lacking in our relationship with God, specifically in worship. The teacher even pointed out that our financial situation and condition is impacted by worship that is either God-honoring or self-serving. So as we re-enter Ecclesiastes near the middle of the book, a couple of things will change for us. One is that the style of writing actually becomes more like what you're familiar with in the book of Proverbs, so I think you'll find it easier to grasp. We're given several imperatives, followed by statements that one thing is in fact better than something else. The other change is that after today, I don't plan to walk through every verse as I have so far. The exception will be the final chapter. Instead, I expect us to look at a variety of the proverbial statements, more or less one topic at a time. For today, we have a combination of a single topic that is covered extensively in a couple of chapters. So come with me to Ecclesiastes 5:8. And you have handouts, hopefully that you pick them up on the way in if you want to fill in some blanks. When it comes to money, some things are very different in our century. On the other hand, no matter how far back we go, some things never change. And because of that, I believe you'll find some of the teacher's points quite relevant to our own experience, beginning with verse 8. If you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight. For one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. The profit of the land is taken by all. The king is served by the field. Oppression and corruption are subtopics under the umbrella of pursuing riches and wealth. These two have been in our news cycle forever, and they are emphasized even more leading up to a national election in the fall. And as the teacher describes things, he also recognizes that such greed is widespread. Now, I'm not sure if there was a name for the property tax collection agency in 1000 BC, but according to this, the various levels of officials did not operate independently. Either they were looking out for their own benefit, or they were looking out for their supervisor, whether they wanted to or not. At each level of the organization, something shady was happening, with the resources coming from the property owners. Everyone in the hierarchy had some skin in the game, or others were stuck, unable to blow the whistle on unethical practices for fear of retribution against themselves or their loved ones. They were being watched, that's what the verse says. While the last verse serves as a summary to the issue being described, it has been a point of conversation and discussion among Bible students. Some understand that last verse as an antidote to the wickedness described in verse 8, and so it would read this way. After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. Or, but this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivating the fields. So let me explain. Biblically, in both the Old and New Testaments, the king, the government officials, are ordained by God to provide justice for the people and to protect them from that which is evil. In the ancient Israel nation particularly, that included looking after a family's property rights. Those parcels of land for one family was literally their survival. It was critical for gardening and livestock, and those families were supposed to be able to pass that down from one generation to the next. So the positive view of this verse is that the king is in the palace to hold those corrupt officials accountable and fix the cycle of corruption. The king who's committed to his people would be the one to intercede for the oppressed and offer justice concerning their property. Now, that's definitely the way it's supposed to be. The other more common understanding of this verse is the one that I think fits the context better. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all, even the king is served from the field. Or, the king himself profits from the field. It is a painful recognition that the only one who gains from this injustice is the leader who stands on the top of the pyramid, above all the other layers of corruption and officials. Corruption abounds, the poor are helpless. Even the king seems to be involved in taking advantage of the laborers in the field. Now, I'm sure this verse has no relevance for today at all. But beyond the unfair confiscation of someone else's wealth and the hunger for more of it, we find something that's kind of interesting here, because an unhealthy desire for riches leads to injustice, theft, and wickedness, among other things that we're going to read about shortly. In fact, as we go through the passage today, let me encourage you to see if you can identify the various terms related to this desire. I've given you a few. The need to be satisfied and filled. And as we come to verse 10, we move to another consequence of that appetite. The one who loves money is never satisfied with money, and whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with income. This too is futile. When good things increase, the one who consumes them multiply. What then is the profit to the owner except to gaze at them with his eyes? The sleep of the worker is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich permits him no sleep. The first lesson on the futility of wealth is painfully obvious. When you love it that much, there's never enough to satisfy. And I'm sure we know of many characters throughout history who were poster children for this insatiable need to have just one more dollar to make it. And then in verse 11, we see our first example of how having more does not mean it stays with you. When good things increase, the ones who consume them multiply. What then is the profit to the owner, except to gaze at them with his eyes? The ones who consume the wealth can be the tax collector from verse 8, the corrupt officials. But in even a more positive case, those who eat up the wealth would include the endless array of potential consumers. For example, the guests who continue to come over for larger parties and celebrations at the wealthy person's house. Then on even larger estates, there's a need for full-time staff in the kitchen, on the grounds, maybe in the stables or the carriage houses. In our day, it would include the upkeep of the classic automobiles behind that 7-door garage. Such consumers would also include the suppliers and the repairmen, the experts that are needed to take care of all the additional stuff that's accumulated. And there are the people who work on the estate that need an income to feed their families, even if they have housing on the complex. Even though great wealth may be coming in, it has to be handed out, feeding guests and visitors, the cost to keep the golf cart updated, along with the mechanic and the maintenance man, to keep the boat and the dock functioning in your backyard. What then is the profit to the owner except to gaze at them with his eyes? Now, there's a couple of ways to look at this. One is that the person with the wealth must now keep his eyes on his possessions at all times, the way he didn't have to before he didn't have them. That's not much of a benefit, and it requires a new focus to protect the stuff. The other option is to simply enjoy those few moments that the money is in your hands. It won't be there very long. Now, since I'm a very simple person when it comes to finances, estate-level wealth is so far beyond my ability to grasp. I still think a cup of coffee should not cost more than $1.50. And I still consider $100 a lot of money. So here's one way to understand how verse 11 might function for us on a normal level. For any particular birthday or Christmas, it is not uncommon for me to receive $50 or $100 in cash. And I feel rich for the day. Unfortunately, the next morning when I go to start the car, the battery is dead. So I find a way to the auto center and hand over my crisp $100 bill in exchange for a new battery. It was great while it lasted. Verse 12. The sleep of the worker is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich permits him no sleep. You see, for his part, the average working man doesn't fret about the business the way that the business owner or the supervisor does. The worker doesn't need to worry about managing the other employees. The worker doesn't carry the concern of obtaining supplies, having them on time, or paying the creditors on time. He simply puts in his hours and goes home at the end of the day. So he may not be rich, and he may not have a full stomach every night like those above him in the chain. But without the additional responsibility, he can go to sleep at night. In contrast, the rich person is either driven by ideas on how to make even more, so he stays up, or he worries about how he might lose everything without keeping a careful watch on all the stuff. Either way, he has trouble sleeping. So let's summarize these observations before we continue. In these verses, we have learned this much about the futility of desiring wealth, and in some cases, just wealth itself. It never offers satisfaction. There's never enough. The increase of riches brings more consumers of those riches, and it cannot offer sleep. Verse 13. There's a sickening tragedy I've seen under the sun, wealth kept by its owner to its harm. That wealth was lost in a bad venture, so when he fathered a son, he was empty-handed. As he came from his mother's womb, so he will go again, naked as he came. He will take nothing for his efforts that he can carry in his hands. We come once again to the dual issues of potential inheritance and death, repeated theme. We looked at this in chapter 2. There, the tragedy was that the rich man had to leave his wealth to an heir that might turn out to be a fool. So the inheritance would be squandered, not valued. Then we saw it again in chapter 4. The tragedy there was that the rich man had no heirs to inherit the wealth. Who gets it then? And why did the rich man work so hard without anybody to leave it to? Here in chapter 6, the situation is even worse. The man has a son. But because of the loss of riches, the man has nothing to give him, whether during his son's lifetime or after the rich man's death. We're not given any explanation for what this financial disaster was, but it just happened. And while it is called a bad venture in this translation, there's nothing to indicate something shady or legal. Events simply take place in the world around us that impact our finances. So the first tragic part of the story is that the very thing that was dependent upon, the riches, ends up evaporating and leaving nothing for this man or his descendants. And you notice that he was not a father before the loss of wealth. He was on his own. And we know his attitude toward everything that he acquired was not right either, because we see evidence in verse 11 that he was hoarding it. Some translations actually say that. You see, the term keeping is about watching over, guarding, and protecting. And usually in the Old Testament, that's a good thing. But read the rest of the account. This is the second unfortunate part of the story, so the author says so again in verse 16. This too is a sickening tragedy. Exactly as he comes, so he will go. What does the one gain who struggles for the wind? What is more, he eats in darkness, and all his days with much sorrow, sickness, and anger. You pay attention to that last verse? In the need to have more, there is a component that affects the soul and heart of a person. He eats in darkness, sickness, sorrow, and anger. His wealth did not bring him any sense of joy or the abundant life when he had it. And in reading this, I bet some of your minds traveled back just a few weeks to picture a famous holiday character that fits this description very well. Eating in darkness, too stingy to burn candles for light or heat or pay his employer or employee a fair wage. From this description, we add to our list of bullet points identifying the futility of riches or chasing after them. Hoarding it doesn't preserve it. And I suppose you can add one more to this that has to do more with a person's outlook, disposition, or personality. It won't bring joy, peace, or health. Let's read it again for an additional observation as well. As he came from his mother's womb, so he will go again. Naked as he came, he will not take anything for his efforts that he can carry in his hands. This too is a sickening tragedy. Exactly as he comes, so he will go. What does the one gain who struggles for the wind? With all the negative side effects of chasing wealth, this one is probably the most relevant. You can't take it with you. Now, I wonder what the prosperity gospel churches would do with Ecclesiastes. And as you ponder that point, let's move ahead to chapter 6. So we're going to skip a little bit to pick up a few more negative descriptions of pursuing wealth. Verse 1. Here's a tragedy that I've observed under the sun, and it weighs heavily on humanity. God gives a man riches, wealth, and honor so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires for himself. But God does not allow him to enjoy them. Instead, a stranger will enjoy them. This is futile and a sickening tragedy. We have an example of a man who not only had material prosperity, but honor. Honor is recognition, respect, being well known in society, having everything, and yet he couldn't enjoy any of it. We're not told why, but God does not allow the satisfaction for some who possess great wealth to enjoy that wealth. And once more, we see a situation where another person will enjoy what the rich man has accumulated instead. A stranger, not a descendant. The capacity to appreciate what God has provided is a critical part to the entire subject of riches. A man may father 100 children and live many years, the description continues. No matter how long he lives, if he's not satisfied by good things and does not even have a proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For the stillborn comes in futility, and he goes in darkness, and his name is shrouded in darkness. Though a stillborn child does not see the sun and is not conscious, it has more rest than he does. And if he lives 1,000 years twice, but does not experience happiness, do not both go to the same place? Methuselah from the Old Testament is the longest living human being, 969 years. Double that, that's what this picture is. And then increase the offspring by an enormous number, 100 kids. Certainly a man who could live that long and have that many descendants would have a huge legacy that he could look back on to find meaning and contentment in his life of 2,000 years. But a stillborn who never woke up, never received a name, never saw the light of day, is better off. Both go to the same place. That's a reference to the grave. They both die. And yet the stillborn is still considered more fortunate for this reason. Because the man who seemed to have it all did not have the ability to take pleasure in any of it. Now, this description, you need to understand, would be quite shocking for the original audience of Solomon. You see, financial wealth, a long life, and having descendants were the trio of evidence that God was blessing you. Then add to this list the honor from verse 2, and this man could not have had it any better. So it is a grievous evil that he has lived because a critical factor was missing. God's blessing includes his enablement to enjoy it. Otherwise, it's just stuff. Verse 7. A man's labor is for his stomach, yet the appetite is never satisfied. Isn't that verse so true? We labor, we have a job in order to fill our stomachs. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way it is. But does it ever get full? Don't we have to eat again tomorrow or like 3 hours from now? In the same way, we are reminded that an appetite for financial gain does not end either. Even when more stuff is required or acquired, there's just no satisfying the hunger. So it's not a healthy appetite. All a man's labor is for his stomach, and yet the appetite is never satisfied. What advantage, then, does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage is there for the poor person who knows how to conduct himself before others? Now, it's another rhetorical question that expects us to answer the same way. There's no advantage here. But this is not a criticism of being wise in verse 8. The wise man does have many advantages over the fool. The book of Proverbs is written primarily for that reason. But verse 8 describes the common understanding of wisdom in relationship to finances. You see, it is the wise person who can manage and accumulate wealth. It is the wise person who is able to pursue opportunities that are beneficial to him and to others. By contrast, the fool is too lazy or looks for quick ways to obtain what he wants and hungers for. The point is that even if the fool could learn how to work with people well and develop wisdom to begin earning his own income and wealth, then what? Now both the wise and the reformed fool are doing all right financially, but can either one achieve satisfaction and meaning in life by accumulating more material things? No. Verse 9. Better what the eyes see than wandering desire. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. This verse actually describes our appetites as if they have taken on a life of their own and have become a separate entity. Those desires then take flight and they wander around the earth in search of what they want. It's kind of a creepy picture when you think about it. And this too is futile. So the lesson is parallel to the one from chapter 5. What then is the profit to the owner who has accumulated riches except to gaze at them with his eyes? Both teachings are ultimately examples of contentment, and it provides a positive point about wealth in comparison to the negative ones that we've been cataloging so far. Enjoy it while you have it. Appreciate what is in your possession at the moment. That contentment is better than allowing your appetite to lead you in a search for what you do not have and cannot keep. Now, there's another word that we've read that correlates to this whole concept of contentment. So let me have you look again at verse 5. Though a stillborn child does not see the sun and is not conscious, it has more rest than he. The concept of rest, satisfaction, fulfillment was built into creation on the seventh day. We were meant to work and we were meant to rest. Even before the fall made it a whole lot more complicated to find some balance between the two. So let me appeal once again to some empathy and appreciation for the plight of those who do not have an eternal perspective on any of this. Now, I doubt that the average person even realizes it. But when that person chases something that looks valuable in their eyes and yet is actually a vapor, they're doing that to find rest. But they're hungering for something that cannot satisfy and will not last. The tragedy is they don't believe that. They're sure that the thing that they're chasing after will provide them something that they desperately need and will give them some lasting value. Now, since believers have a more biblical worldview, we can offer an alternative avenue for them to find satisfaction as we talk with them about the very thing that they're chasing and how that thing is futile. Those desires that our friends bring up in conversation, the relatives that we talk to, those points in the conversation about the things that they need can be the very points that we use in order to turn that into a conversation about the fullness of true hope. Remember, the deep longing for the human soul to find rest is one that Jesus came to offer. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. True rest is rooted in our relationship with Him, not other things. And when that rest is found, it impacts our work ethic. It impacts how we go about accumulating the things that we do. The person at rest with God is at rest in this life, independently of the stuff we have or what we don't have. How many find rest by acquiring great wealth? I don't know. How many find rest in great poverty? I don't know. How many find rest without Christ? None. So let's go back to the section that we skipped over, which is sandwiched between this extended discussion about riches. Now, we've created a bullet point list of the futility of wealth. But what's the lesson concerning the good things that do come into our hands? Well, it's the same lesson that we've seen twice before. Chapter 5, verse 18. Here is what I have seen to be good. It is appropriate to eat, drink, and experience good in all the labor one does under the sun. During the few days of his life God has given him, because that is his reward. God has also given riches and wealth to every man, and he has allowed him to enjoy them, take his reward, and rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God. For he does not often consider the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy of his heart. Because we are flawed and imperfect, it is extremely easy to miss this aspect of riches. And here it is. There is a God component to the whole subject of wealth. And that component has everything to do with our ability to find some satisfaction or benefit with the things that we do have. Now, if we need a reminder in the context of living through national inflation, increased costs, and rising taxes, this is a valuable reminder. When it comes to acquiring wealth on earth, the issue is never going to be about how much or how little we actually have in our hands. It is that God enables us to find value and good in things that come our way. Perhaps that's why the author placed this third reminder of this truth in the middle of this subject, between chapter 5 and chapter 6. You see, the world assumes, and I think we do too if we're not careful, that these two are tied together in some kind of inherent, immutable unity. Here it is. Riches and the ability to enjoy. It's all the same. But they're not. As chapter 6 clearly demonstrated with the man who had it all. God does not allow him to enjoy them. Now, you may have the capacity to acquire great wealth. Many people do, and God bless them. Others have little to nothing, and yet have the ability to enjoy the things that they do. Both riches and the ability to appreciate them are gifts of God, but they don't always end up in the same life. So here's another way to capsulize what we're learning, which undermines the world's assumption about wealth. Having things does not equal the capacity to enjoy them. And once again, gratitude is a mindset that develops once we realize that we do not deserve the good that we get, and yet God gives it to us anyway. Since we've seen this teaching 3 times now, have you noticed where it is that we are encouraged to find things of value or profit on earth? It is the simplest items that make up a truly good life. Enjoying work, food, and drink. Enjoying good in life also includes the interactions with others who participate with you in these life's simple blessings. This is from God's hand. Who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from him? I know that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and to enjoy the good life. This is also the gift of God. He has allowed him to enjoy them. This is the gift of God. 3 separate reminders. And as we appreciate the basic provisions as they come into our hands and pass through our hands, we find good. We find something that is temporary. Yes, it is vapor, but it does have some value. Enjoy it while you have it. And because of that, we don't have the same need to be consumed with the worries of the world, because our attention is now on God's gifts, as small or great as they may be. Material things, in fact, can bring great joy, and they're certainly part of God's blessing. But we have to understand life from God's viewpoint so that such treasures are kept in proper perspective. The discipline is to set our minds to look for and recognize that which is good. To literally focus our thoughts on those things in order to be thankful and enjoy them when they do come into our hands. Whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy. Think about those things and not the news feed on your Twitter account. As we take those moments to enjoy what God has given us, we will not spend our energy fretting so much about how short life really is, or about how futile life sometimes appears, and how much we've acquired or lost in our material wealth. As only Dr. Warren Wiersbe can say, it is an established fact that the people who have the most birthdays live the longest. But if they keep complaining about getting old, they will have very little to enjoy. So here's some balance to consider also by Dr. Wiersbe. If we focus more on the gifts than the giver, we're guilty of idolatry. If we accept his gifts but complain about them, we're guilty of ingratitude. If we hoard his gifts and will not share them with others, we're guilty of indulgence. But if we yield to his will and use what he gives us for his glory, then we can enjoy life and be satisfied. Father, let that be our prayer for us today. And as we go into the work week, and as the W-2s come through and we see how much we owe in taxes at the end of the month, Father, give us a perspective that is eternal so that the temporal pain and yuck does not consume us or our hearts or our attitudes. Father, give us patience to be able to wait things out when some notice comes through that it looks like our financial situation is going to get even darker. Give us the ability to wait on you, to see what comes next without panic and worry. And Father, I do pray for those in our congregation, those in our extended church family that are struggling with financial questions, not certain where that next dollar is coming from for some significant bill, that you would enable them to lean into you, to hold on to you, and to trust you even when the pain is awful. Father, give us your grace to be the best representatives of your Son that we can be, both in our attitudes, in our work, and in our finances. And help us to be good stewards of that which you gave us so that we don't create more trouble on our own, but have nothing to do with you. You are a great God, and you give us great things. Allow us to appreciate them today. Amen.